Order 66 is one of the darkest moments in all of Star Wars. In Revenge of the Sith, we saw Jedi cut down in a haunting montage, but the truth is, the films only scratched the surface. It wasn't until the Clone Wars that we finally understood the full horror of what happened. Because in the Clone Wars, the clones weren't traitors. They weren't secretly waiting to betray their Jedi generals. They were slaves to inhibitor chips buried in their brains. One second they were laughing with their commanders, the next they were programmed to kill them without hesitation. That is not betrayal, that is control. And that control is what makes the tragedy even worse. These weren't nameless soldiers. They were Rex, Fives, Echo, Jesse. Men we knew, men we loved, suddenly stripped of everything that made them human. Their individuality, their emotions, their bonds, all erased by a single order. That is why the Clone Wars portrayal hit so much harder than the films. Think about Rex holding back tears as he turned on Ahsoka, or Fives uncovering the truth only to die unheard, or Ahsoka burying her brothers under a field of helmets. These are images that stay with you because they show us that the clones were not villains. They were victims. It also reframes the entire saga. The Jedi were doomed not by betrayal but by design. Palpatine didn't just outthink them, he enslaved their army from the inside out. And when the Order came, the Jedi never had a chance. That is why the show's version is so unforgettable. In this video, we are going to break down how the Clone Wars portrayed the tragedy of Order 66, why the clones had no choice, and how turning faceless soldiers into human beings made this one of the most heartbreaking stories in Star Wars. When Revenge of the Sith first showed us Order 66, it was devastating but brief. A montage of Jedi being gunned down across the galaxy, while John Williams' haunting score drove the tragedy home. It worked cinematically, but it left questions unanswered. Why did the clones, who had fought side by side with Jedi for years, suddenly turn without hesitation? Were they secretly waiting for this order, or was there something deeper at play? The Clone Wars provided that missing context, and in doing so, made the event far more heartbreaking. The introduction of inhibitor chips in the show reframed everything. Suddenly the clones weren't betrayers, they were victims. These chips were programmed from the moment of their creation, buried in their heads like time bombs waiting to go off. It wasn't loyalty that broke, it was free will being stripped away. 1 second a clone could be joking with his general, the next he was locked into a command he could not disobey. That kind of forced obedience is chilling, and it makes the tragedy of Order 66 even deeper. The brilliance of the Clone Wars was in how it slowly seeded this idea. We saw hints of it with the mysterious malfunctions, like in the case of Toop, whose chip activated early and caused him to kill Jedi Master Tippler. His confusion, his horror at what he had done, was the audience's first window into just how little control these soldiers really had. And when Fives investigated, his discovery of the chips turned his story into one of the most gut-wrenching arcs in the entire series. Fives knew the truth, but nobody believed him. The Kaminoans covered it up, Palpatine manipulated events, and even the clones themselves doubted what was happening. Watching a loyal soldier unravel under the weight of a conspiracy he could not stop is pure tragedy. By the time he was killed, shouting warnings no one could understand, the inevitability of Order 66 was locked in. That story elevated the clones beyond nameless troopers. It made them sympathetic figures trapped in a system designed to use and discard them. When the final season arrived, everything came to a head with Rex and Ahsoka. Their bond had been built across years of battles, victories, and personal moments. So when Palpatine issued the infamous command, Rex fought it for just a moment. That flicker of hesitation, that tear in his eye, is what sells the horror. He didn't want to do it, but the chip left him no choice. Watching him beg Ahsoka to find Fives before turning his blasters on her is one of the most gut-wrenching moments in Star Wars. That sequence is why the Clone Wars nailed Order 66 better than the films ever could. In the movies, the clones were faceless soldiers mowing down Jedi. In the show, they were individuals, men we knew by name and personality, suddenly stripped of everything that made them human. It wasn't betrayal, it was enslavement. That difference changes everything about how we interpret the fall of the Jedi. The Jedi never stood a chance because the very army they relied on was hardwired to destroy them. This wasn't just Palpatine's genius, it was systemic cruelty. The Republic had unwittingly created an army that was programmed to turn, and the Jedi walked straight into the trap. That's why the Clone Wars portrayal is so devastating. It reminds us that Order 66 wasn't a sudden betrayal, but an inevitable conclusion. Even the smaller moments highlight this. Jesse, a clone we had followed for years, turns on Ahsoka without hesitation once the order is given. Vaughn and the 392nd, painted in her colours, aim their blasters at her within minutes. These weren't mindless drones, they were loyal soldiers forced into slaughter. That makes every shot fired a tragedy, rather than a twist. The impact of the Clone Wars portrayal of Order 66 lies in how it humanized the clones before ripping that humanity away. Throughout the series, the clones were not interchangeable soldiers, they were individuals. Episodes like Rookies showed them bonding, doubting, and proving themselves. Characters like Rex, Cody, Fives, and Echo became fan favourites because they had personalities, flaws, and growth. By the time Order 66 happened, we weren't watching nameless troopers kill Jedi, we were watching characters we cared about lose control of their own minds. This is what made Rex's hesitation so powerful. He wasn't just another commander turning on his general. He was Rex, a man we'd followed since the beginning, a loyal soldier who developed a friendship with Ahsoka that transcended the chain of command. When the order hit, his struggle lasted only seconds, but those seconds said more than the entire film montage. That tear in his eye, the shaking blaster, the desperate plea to find Fives told us everything. He was trapped inside his own body, screaming against the command. The Clone Wars also explored the aftermath in ways the films never could. Ahsoka's decision not to kill her brothers, but to find a way to remove Rex's chip, gave the story an added layer of tragedy and hope. The scene where she holds him down while the droid operates, all while blaster bolts ricochet around them, is one of the tensest sequences in the series. And when Rex finally comes back, his broken "I almost killed you" line is devastating. That is the price of Palpatine's plan. Another angle the show nailed was the systemic cruelty of the Republic. The clones were designed to be expendable, stripped of freedom from birth, and then forced into a war they didn't choose. Adding inhibitor chips was the final insult. They weren't just soldiers, they were living weapons with built-in self-destructs. The tragedy is not just that they killed the Jedi, but that they were never given the chance to be anything else. Episodes like The Deserter showed us what could have been. Cut Lorquain, a clone who abandoned the army, built a family, and lived a peaceful life. His existence proved the clones had the potential for individuality and happiness, and yet by design, almost none of them would ever see that future. Order 66 erased even the possibility. The brilliance of the series is how it made us complicit as viewers. We cheered the clones through battles, laughed at their banter, and celebrated their victories. Then, when the chips activated, we had to watch those same characters slaughter Jedi without hesitation. The whiplash is the point. It mirrors the Jedi's own blindness, trusting an army that was never truly theirs to begin with. And let's not forget the larger implications. Order 66 wasn't just the death of the Jedi, it was the death of the clones' humanity. From that point forward, the galaxy saw them as mindless enforcers of the Empire, stormtroopers with no individuality. The Clone Wars reminds us that beneath that armour were men who once had names, personalities, and friendships. That loss is what makes the tragedy resonate long after the credits roll. It also reframes our view of the Jedi themselves. By relying on the clones, the Jedi inadvertently doomed themselves. They trusted soldiers who were literally programmed to betray them, and that blind faith highlights their arrogance. The show doesn't absolve the Jedi, it complicates them. They were victims, yes, but also enablers of a system they never fully understood. The Clone Wars also left us with haunting questions about what could have been if things had gone differently. What if Fives had lived to expose the inhibitor chips? What if Rex had convinced Ahsoka sooner? What if the Jedi had stopped to ask why an army of identical soldiers was so compliant? The tragedy is that the answers don't matter, because the system was designed to make failure inevitable. That inevitability is what makes Order 66 so unforgettable. The show made it clear that the clones were not villains, but victims of a galaxy-sized conspiracy. Their lives were stolen before they began, their choices erased before they could make them. Watching Jesse or Vaughn turn their weapons on Ahsoka isn't shocking. It's horrifying because we know they didn't want to. It's like watching someone possessed, powerless to stop themselves. That helplessness is what makes the tragedy cut deeper than the films ever could. It also adds layers to how we view later Star Wars stories. When we see stormtroopers in the original trilogy, they feel less like random henchmen and more like echoes of what the clones became, stripped of individuality, stripped of identity, trapped inside a system they cannot escape. The Clone Wars connects those dots, showing us that Palpatine's greatest weapon was not the Death Star or his lightning. It was control, the ability to take away choice. This is why Rex's survival matters so much. He carries the guilt of what happened, even though it wasn't his fault. That guilt is what makes him compelling when he returns in Rebels. He is a man living with the knowledge that his brothers had no choice, but the galaxy will always see them as traitors. His burden is not just surviving, but remembering. That's what keeps the tragedy alive, long after the war ends. The show also forces us to reconsider the morality of cloning itself. Was the Republic justified in creating an army of men bred for war? If the chips hadn't existed, would the clones have still been free? Or were they always trapped in a system that valued them only as tools? By giving the clones individuality, the series makes us feel the weight of that question in every battle. Humour also creeps in, which makes the tragedy sharper. We laughed at the Bad Batch's antics, smiled at Echo's stubbornness, and admired Rex's dry wit. Those moments of levity are what make the final turn so crushing. Star Wars has always mixed light and dark, but the Clone Wars perfected it by showing us joy right before ripping it away. The way the final season ends is perhaps the most haunting of all. Ahsoka and Rex bury their fallen brothers, clone helmets lined up in the snow, and Vader himself visits the graves years later. That visual alone encapsulates the tragedy. The clones were victims, forgotten by history, remembered only by the few who knew the truth. Their individuality erased even in death. It's also important to note how this story changes our view of Anakin. In the films, he's portrayed as the Jedi who fell to darkness, but in the Clone Wars, he is also the general who built deep bonds with his soldiers. Knowing those same men turned on him adds a cruel irony to his fall. He lost not just his order, but the trust of the brothers he led. It deepens his eventual transformation into Vader. By humanizing the clones, the Clone Wars forced us to confront the reality of what Order 66 meant. It wasn't betrayal, it was tragedy on every level. Jedi dead, clones enslaved, and a galaxy reshaped by the loss of choice. That's why the show's version resonates more than the films. It made us feel the weight of every shot fired, every helmet dropped, and every life stolen by a single command. In the end, the Clone Wars showed Order 66 not as a twist of fate, but as the inevitable result of a system designed for control. The clones had no choice, and that lack of choice is what makes them the most tragic heroes in Star Wars.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.